Good morning, y'all. My name is Dustin Jones. This is the PT on Ice Daily Show. It's a Wednesday, so that means it's Jerry on Ice, where myself or Christina Previtt or Alan Fredendahl, like last week, will talk about all things older adults and how you can better serve some of your patients. Good morning, Melissa. Wanted to start off by saying it is 8:34 on Wednesday, so the first thing that should come to your mind is A, that Jerry on Ice is on, but also Hump Day Hustling has been sent out. Jeff Moore has just sent an email to many of you all, 8:30 a.m., 5 super helpful links that I look forward to every single Wednesday as soon as I get off of this podcast. So if you're not signed up for that, ptonice.com, go to the bottom, sign up for Hump Day Hustling. Very clinically helpful email, all the goods. Good morning, Kelsey. Good morning, David. Okay, no weights, no problem. That's the title of today's podcast. As Christine and I are teaching more and more and more and interacting with more and more clinicians, we are seeing some themes rise up in some of the conversations, and there's definitely a consistent theme with the folks that may be home health therapists, so my people, where I spend most of my time in home health, people in a skilled nursing facility, people that are in acute care, for example, that there are some challenges in implementing a lot of the things that we discuss in our courses and on this podcast as well. We are big advocates for loading our patients, to applying that external resistance to really increase that intensity to get a positive adaptation. We are absolutely sick of the underdosed therapeutic exercise that is rampant in our profession. That is the main goal of this course, Modern Management of the Older Adult. We want to absolutely eradicate that. However, there are certain situations where loading can be rather difficult and challenging. I think of in the home health setting where I have several people where irritability may be very high. There may be some type of orthopedic issue where we're not going to be loading too much, like a fracture, for example. Some different things that really make it difficult for folks to apply load. There may be the practical example of the home health people that are in dense urban areas like Philly or New York City, for example, where it may be tough to haul around a bunch of weights, because I can drive around and I've got 7 kettlebells in my trunk that I can pull out to use with my patients. Some folks don't have that luxury. What about acute care? Sometimes loading people up in the acute setting may not be the best thing for that person in that moment. So what do we do when we're advocating load, 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 load? Let's get them lifting heavy, relatively heavy things. What can we do about that? So let's talk about some of the options here. The first thing that we really teach in our course and really speak to is the concept of scaling, that we want to be a master of scale, think of all the factors given a particular exercise that we can modify and change to allow this person to move through a range of motion with that external load to get that adaptation. The biggest thing that we can often manipulate is going to be that range of motion, the range of motion of that particular movement. If we're talking a squat or a deadlift, for example, reducing the range of motion dramatically can allow you to apply that external resistance to get that systemic response. Now, we advocate for loading early and often, and even in the presence of someone not being able to do a full range of motion deadlift or a full range of motion squat, we would rather prefer a loaded partial range of motion squat to get some of those systemic benefits quickly for a lot of the folks that we're working with, especially for the folks that may be on that frailty spectrum, for example, or the risk of functional decline is very, very high, that we would much rather have a loaded partial range of motion movement as compared to a greater range of motion with no load, for example. So being a master of scale, thinking of all those factors that we can manipulate to get people moving with external resistance, that's the biggest thing that we advocate for. But even then, it can be difficult to load folks, especially in some of those more acute settings. So I wanted to highlight a few articles that I found absolutely fascinating of people that are really taking this issue of certain types of patients that it is difficult to load them up. What can we do to give them appropriate stimulus to actually get a response? So there's one author and his team that have written a couple exercises that I think you'll enjoy. Fujita is the last name, and I'll just go through a couple of these that will hopefully give you some ideas, especially for the folks that are home healthers, SNF, acute care, and the outpatient folk too. Just some practical ways to solve this issue that we're seeing in our profession. This is titled Effects of Bodyweight Squat Training on Muscular Size, Strength, and Balance Ability in Physically Frail Older Adults. And so what they did this is a small study, so it was only around 15 people, older adults that were, considered kind of on that frailty spectrum. And they took them in a group setting because that is the most cost effective for many folks, especially if they're in some type of long-term facility like they were for this study. They took them in a room and they started playing music that those folks were familiar with, and they started singing. It may have been, Chance the Rapper, for example, DaBaby, maybe, I don't know, Marvin Gaye, James Brown, I don't know. I don't know what song it was. They didn't say. It was a traditional song a lot of the folks knew. They wouldn't know Chance the Rapper. I hope they don't. Anyway, they had a song and they sang. While they were singing, they were squatting. It's about a 3-minute song, squatting the whole time. Each rep was about 4 seconds up and down, and they just kept busting them out. And each song averaged around 48 squats per song. They did that 2 times a week. All right, so they would gather, put some tunes on, start squatting in a group for about 3 minutes, knock them out, and then go on their day. 2 times a week for 12 weeks. And so what they were looking at, they looked at how that impacted their balance in a static and a dynamic situation, but also their strength, their strength, their knee extensor torque relative to their body mass. And so what they found was a significant change in that knee extensor torque compared to body mass. So they got much, much stronger in a very relatively short period of time over 12 weeks. But they also had changes in their vastus lateralis muscular thickness as well. So they had actual, this wasn't neural adaptation, but actual physiological adaptations and changes in a 12-week period just from doing bodyweight squats 2 times a week for a 3-minute song. I mean, think of all the patients that we could do this with. And I think of all the folks that I had a difficult time loading due to some issue in terms of irritability, or maybe there was some type of precaution against it due to a surgery or some type of injury, or they just didn't want to handle load. They didn't like the thought of that external resistance, and it was difficult to get that buy-in. I could throw on a song that they're familiar with and have them do squats 2 times a week and be able to show that they improved in terms of their knee extensor strength relative to their body mass, and they actually had those physiological changes to their vastus lateralis. That's awesome. Now, this study did not show changes in balance ability, which they didn't really do much balance training. So they didn't really do any interventions to specifically address those specific balance deficits, even though oftentimes it can be force production issues. But they did show a significant change there. They went on to continue this study and say, okay, so that was 2 times a week, which is very manageable for a lot of people. And they're trying to think of what's super practical for a lot of folks, but then also what's kind of that minimum effective dose. They went on to continue to do this study 12 more weeks. I'm not sure if it was the same group of people, but it was the same number of participants. And they did 3 times a week. So they turned on Chance the Rapper or DaBaby or whatever song it was, and they started singing, and they were doing 48 squats during that song. And they did that for 3 times a week over a 12-week period. And they measured a lot of the same things. They didn't look at balance, though. But the big thing that was really interesting about this article, I didn't read the title to you, did I? Repeated sit-to-stand exercise enhances muscular strength and reduces lower body muscular demands in physically frail elders. This is an experimental gerontology, February 2019. I'm going to put all the links on the Facebook post. For the Instagrammers and the podcast listeners, find that Facebook post and you'll see all this stuff. But what they looked at was that did that improve their knee extensor strength relative to their body mass, but they also looked at relative effort. So at baseline, what they did was they took basically threw on EMG and then had them do a squat to see the relative effort of their vastus lateralis as they were performing that sit-to-stand, and compared that to a maximum voluntary contraction. So they got relative effort. And over that period of 12 weeks, they had similar changes in their knee extensor strength relative to their body mass, and changes in the muscle morphology as the muscle was thicker, but they also reduced their effort in that sit-to-stand. So they went from, on average, 50% of their relative effort was going to perform this sit-to-stand, and that lowered down to 43% after 12 weeks of training. And that right there really speaks to, good morning, Craig, the 1 rep max living that we're speaking to in our course and on this podcast is a decent amount, is that That is when someone's maximum capacity is near or below the demands of daily life, whatever activity it may be. We tell a story in our course about Gary or Gare Bear and his difficulty with deadlifting a laundry basket, but it could be doing stairs, it could be doing sit to stands, it could be carrying groceries from the trunk to the kitchen. It's our job to determine, where in those people's lives are they one rep max living, because they are at risk for functional decline and decreased independence and a lot of that negative sequelae that can come as a result. And they're really starting to measure this. There's a handful of studies that are looking at relative effort of particular tasks compared to someone's capacity. And they did this looking at, the sit to stand. So they went from 50% of their one rep max, for example, performing the sit to stand. And at the end of this training, 3 times a week, body squat training to Chance the Rapper or Debate, whatever song it was they were singing to, took it down to roughly 43% of their effort. And you think about the difference. I mean, 7% doesn't sound like a lot, but for those, especially those that lift a lot of weight and that are using calculations off of their one rep max, that is absolutely amazing. 7% is a big difference. You're going to feel that. It's going to be a lot easier. And you think of how many times we do sit to stands throughout our day, that's pretty significant. All it was body weight squat training. It's crazy. So all that to say, we do want to load people up. However, we want to really focus more on the intensity of that we can go without weight to failure and get some changes. Now, it may not be as significant as if those folks had a kettlebell doing a goblet squat. We don't know. They didn't compare that. However, if that's not if that's not on the table, we can still get people moving and we can work them to fatigue at a relatively high intensity, even without weight, and get some positive adaptations, and that's what we're hoping for. Now, lastly, the third thing that I do want to mention for if no weight, what can we do in that issue is I want to bring up blood flow restriction training. May have mentioned this a few times on the podcast. I've mentioned it several times on the Joe's Health podcast, but blood flow restriction training is an amazing tool that can allow you to apply basically a tourniquet, but it's made specifically for this use, to a limb to where you can load that limb up maybe 20 to 30% of their one rep max, and you're going to get similar changes in terms of hypertrophy for sure as if you were loading people up to 80% of their one rep max, for example. But there are some interesting studies that looking at blood flow restriction training, how does that impact people's function even when we're not loading them? All right, so this study, and I'll put a link in the Facebook post to this as well. This is in 2017, blood flow restriction walking and physical function older adults in randomized controlled trial. So this is a walking program, 6-week walking program, where they had people with their blood flows being restricted, both legs. They were walking, doing this walking program, and then the control group, they were just walking without blood flow restriction. All right, so pretty standard program. A lot of people that we work with could do this. The only difference is that they had those blood flow restriction tourniquets on both limbs for that intervention group. And at the end of it, after 6 weeks, there was a 2.5 to 4.5 fold greater improvement in performance on all measures of physical function compared with the control group. And when they measured physical function, what they did was take, let me make sure I get this right, the 30-second sit-to-stand test, you've heard us talk about that, the 6-minute walk test, we've talked about that, the timed up and go, we've talked about that, and then a step test. 2.5 to 4.5 greater increase just by throwing some blood flow restriction tourniquets around folks. So I'm fascinated with the technology behind blood flow restriction training, and the evidence and its application to older adults is just continuing to grow. Kyle Kimbrell with Owens Recovery Science is one to talk to about that. He's a great guy. It's a great resource. But those are some ideas and some things to think about. If we don't have weight or it's difficult to load, people don't want to have external resistance, what can we do? We can be a master of scale. We can modify range of motion, for example. It's going to be the most common thing that we can do to really get people moving in a shorter range of motion. Under load is going to get adaptation. That's going to be perfectly fine. We can also do body weight. Body weight to failure at a relatively high intensity can get the job done in terms of getting some positive adaptations. That group showed it with, 2 to 3 times a week of doing squats to a song. A lot of our patients can benefit from that as well. And then last but not least, blood flow restriction training is a great option in this department too. So think about those folks that it is challenging to load them, don't give up, okay? Don't just give in to the underdose therapeutic exercise. Continue to fight to have an appropriate intensity, and think of some of these ideas to really leverage that time that we have with these folks to make some change. All right, so that's all I got. Check that Hump Day Hustling email in your inbox. If you're not getting that email, go to ptonice.com, go to the bottom, put your name and your email. If you don't see it in your inbox and you already signed up, check your junk folder. Just make sure that it's coming to you. Make sure you click on it and interact in that email just to make sure it doesn't go to a junk folder later on. But it's going to be good. It's always good. 5 helpful links, 8:30 a.m. every Wednesday. Good morning, Alyssa. Also, Modern Management of the Older Adult. We just kicked off our latest online cohort. Awesome group of folks. Our next one's going to be in January, so that just went up on the site. And then we've got, I think, a couple spots left for our New Jersey course. That's the first weekend of November. So if you live in the New Jersey, New York area, and you're wanting to get some live continuing education, a fun, jam-packed weekend, Christina Previtt's going to be there. Alex Germano is going to be there as well. Sign up for that. 2 spots left. All right. You have a good one. I'll talk to you soon.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to the PT on Ice Daily Show. If you enjoyed this content, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. And be sure to check us out on Facebook and Instagram at the Institute of Clinical Excellence. If you're interested in getting plugged into more ICE content on a weekly basis while earning CEUs from home, check out our virtual ICE online mentorship program at ptonice.com. While you're there, sign up for our Hump Day Hustling newsletter for a free email every Wednesday morning with our top 5 research articles and social media posts that we think are worth reading. Head over to ptonice.com and scroll to the bottom of the page to sign up.